Hi, my name is Jose Alanis, and I am the chair of the executive committee of ICAF, and I am very happy to welcome you today to the 18th International Comic Arts Forum Conference. We are delighted with the turnout and with the weather, even though we're going to be looking at it from in here for most of the day. And we are thrilled when we look at our schedule and look at all of you at what we have to look forward to over the next couple of days. Let me tell you a few words about ICAF, and my comments will be very brief before I turn it over to my other co-presenters here. ICAF was started in 1995 in the Washington, D.C. area. We pride ourselves as the leading comic studies conference in the U.S., and we have, since about 2008, moved from the East Coast origins of the conference to places like Chicago, the Art Institute of Chicago. In 2013, we went to Portland, the West Coast, for the first time. And now, I'm very happy to say that we are having our first conference in the South. I'm very happy to have that happen. That was a personal dream of mine to bring it. I'm from the South originally, in Texas. So I'm very, very happy to be here in South Carolina with you guys. Let me read a few words from our mission statement. ICAF's mission is to foster recognition of comic art as an international phenomenon, both by seeking common ground between various world traditions and by exploring the crucial differences between them, to welcome a multidisciplinary and pluralistic approach to the study of comic art, with due attention to larger cultural, political, literary, and artistic contexts, to encourage discussion and collaboration among academics, independent scholars, comics professionals, and the wider public, and to provide an accessible showcase for innovative comic scholarship and comic art with special emphasis on traditions hitherto neglected in English language studies. So with the gathering of specialists and artists and guests at this conference, I think we are very, very well on our way to fulfilling that mission in this iteration of the conference. Very briefly, I just wanted to thank the wonderful, wonderful people that I have been working with the most directly over the last 18 months to organize this conference. Some of them are not able to make it, unfortunately, but I did want to bring their names up for you. Our wonderful academic director, Toff Marshall, who if you were proposing material for this conference, you were interacting with him. Our fundraising coordinator, Brittany Tullis, our program director, Brandon Costello, did a wonderful job his first time out here in the job. Our promotions coordinator, Mark Heiberman, who is not able to come. Our secretary, Elizabeth Neidem. And our new treasurer, our junior member, Arturo Mejía de Lápido, who is also not able to attend. And our members at large, Bill Cartolopoulos, coming tomorrow, and Casey Brenza, who's not able to attend. They've done an amazing, amazing job, and I'm just so happy to work with them. They're the greatest. And I'd love to give them a hand. Thank you. But of course, none of this would be possible. None of us would be here at all without our wonderful site liaison, Kiana Whitted, who made it all basically happen. Made it all happen. There's one more first for this conference, and that is it is our first one to be made in collaboration, to be organized in collaboration and partnership with the dynamic and new and very exciting Comic Studies Society. You couldn't have missed their banner walking in here, obviously, and a number of you are members. So with that in mind, I present to you the president and the founder of the Comic Studies Society, Charles Hadfield, for his remarks, please. Charles.
Yeah, thanks, Jose, and thanks to the entire executive committee of ICAF for putting on this conference and for kindly hosting us from the Comic Studies Society, the CSS, comicsociety.org. Many of you will know that URL already. ICAF's a splendid annual tradition, sort of a beacon to comic studies at large, and we in the society couldn't be more proud to partner with this conference. And again, a special shout out to our site liaison, Kiana, for doing so much hands-on work to help boost our CSS presence here in Columbia and make us feel at home. We couldn't have as robust a presence or couldn't shine our lantern quite as brightly without Kiana and her team of volunteers here on the ground at the University of South Carolina. So thank you so much for that. This ICAF marks the first conference substantially co-sponsored by the Comic Studies Society, though we have sponsored some other events, for example, at the Dartmouth conference on comics and animation, and also in Chicago. But this is our first really full-on experience of a partnership in a sustained sense. Again, this couldn't be better for our nascent society than to be able to work with ICAF. So I'm going to take a couple of minutes to tell you what we are all about in the Comic Studies Society. We're a nonprofit learned society or professional association for anyone with a serious interest in comic scholarship. That includes researchers, teachers, critics, from all disciplines and backgrounds, whether students or academics, independent scholars, comics artists or other comics professionals, librarians and archivists, and just anyone who has an interest in sustaining and growing the field of comic studies. So CSS, and I quote from our mission statement, supports the critical study of comics as an art and a communicative form, the building of resources for comics teaching and research, and open and ongoing conversation about the comics world. That includes the many different genres, media, cultures, and traditions that make up the comics world. So all aspects of comics, all genres, and traditions in sequential art, graphic narrative, cartooning, they're all relevant to the mission of the CSS. We built CSS to provide comic scholars a kind of supportive framework that it seems that scholars in a lot of other more entrenched or traditional fields have been able to rely on, and to nurture a sense of community across this diverse and interdisciplinary field. We believe that it's time to bring some more concerted institution building to comic studies to supplement the and to support the incredible intellectual activity that we've seen over the last 20 years and more. So CSS hopes to do that, to help build institutions and to bolster comic studies and encourage its growth both inside and outside of academia. So CSS was actually established at the last ICAF in Columbus, Ohio, late in 2014, and since that time we've been pretty much laying a groundwork, doing all the things that are necessary to get our society up and going. So it's only very recently that we've actually begun taking in members. What we call our founding drive or founding membership drive began on Valentine's Day a couple of months ago. And it's only since then that we've actually been bringing in members, and I'm so glad to be able to say that as of right now, we have more than 430 members from 25 countries. So it's been amazing to see that. Thank you. Thank you for that. So the founding membership drive actually, and this is kind of, I don't know, it's a little strange to say it, but it actually ends at midnight tonight, the founding membership drive, where you can get on board with these, what we think of as a kind of founding membership deal and 2-year membership. And that's always been timed to end here at ICAF. So at midnight tonight, Eastern time, local time, the founding drive will be ending. That doesn't mean that people cannot join after that. It just means that our founding membership deals are going to be turning over and replaced by something else. So that ends at midnight tonight. So if you've been interested in joining and you haven't had an opportunity to do so, visit our table outside in the hall and talk to myself or to Susan Kirtley, or any of the other many members of CSS that are going to be here. So if you've been planning to do that under the founding membership drive and have not had a chance to do so, you might wish to do that today. We're actually in our first round of elections buying the paying members as well. And there are people right here in this room who are standing for election for offices on the CSS board. And the elections end as of 8 o'clock local time on Saturday morning. That means that we can announce our new officers during the closing remarks at the end of the day at ICAF on Saturday. So we wanted to make ICAF, sort of the festive and ceremonial place where we could bring all that to a close. Students who want to build a future in comic studies, I urge you to liaise with people from the Graduate Student Caucus of the CSS, and our table out in the hallway has some bookmark information about Grad Student Caucus, which is an autonomous body within the society that has its own officers, its own bylaws and rules of governance. And in fact, Grad Student Caucus is having a meeting noon tomorrow, right here, Ben, yeah? Yeah, 11:40, right here in this room, a kind of lunchtime meeting, business meeting. All people interested in the Grad Student Caucus welcome to attend That's Ben Owen, by the way, the current, although I believe outgoing president of the Grad Student Caucus. Is that correct, Ben? Right, and succeeding you as president will be Colin, right? Okay, Colin Beinecke as well. So if CSS can't help in the professional development and the building of opportunities for students in the field, then we're not doing anything. And that's the most important thing. So do speak to the Grad Student Caucus representatives or attend that meeting tomorrow at 11:40. Thank you for that. We have all kinds of things planned for the future. I'll say a little bit more about that at our luncheon at midday today. We have things coming up that we think will help to build on the excitement here. So we have a luncheon today that's co-sponsored by CSS and ICAF, and we'll also be holding a CSS-sponsored evening reception tomorrow night, right after Howard Cruz's evening talk. That'll be happening as well. Right, tomorrow night. That's what I meant to say. I hope I did say it. We'll be hosting a reception tomorrow night, Friday, immediately after Howard's keynote talk. We hope you'll drop in and join us for that later on the Friday evening as well. Let me briefly acknowledge the various members of the Comic Studies Society. Some are here now. Some will be here. Some cannot come. But I want to thank all our members. And that includes Jose, also Corey Creekmore, who will be joining us later at this conference, and Brian, where are you? Brian Crimmins, likewise on the CSS board, and Rebecca Wanzo, and Kiana, and of course Ben and his colleagues in the Grad Student Caucus, our journal editor Jared Gardner, who unfortunately can't be with us right now, our web editor, Dave Lewis, likewise can't be with us, but he's been vital for this. And I want to acknowledge our secretary, Susan Kirtley, who is out in the corridor even now manning our table, and our treasurer and membership intake coordinator. Those of you who have joined CSS recently have communicated with her. That's Nora Serrano, who will be with us a little bit later on today. So those people comprise the board, but as of Saturday, there will be others. All right, so thank you very much, everyone. And I want to turn the podium over at this point to the tireless and essential site liaison for this ICAF, University of South Carolina English professor, Kiana Whiddon. Kiana?
Hi, everybody. I'm going to be brief. I'm here to welcome you to South Carolina. This is really a pleasure for me to have so many of my favorite amazing people all on my campus. This is great. We have all worked tirelessly over the past year to get you all here and to plan a conference that you will enjoy. I thank you so much for coming. I want you to be aware that I have students who are helping to volunteer if you ever need anything. They've got the Dark Horse lanyards, the cool ones. And I also want, if you'll bear with me for a second, make sure that I thank at the very start of our conference some of the units on campus who also worked across campus to contribute to the conference, and that includes the USC Provost Office Visiting Scholar Program, the English Department, African American Studies Program, the Women and Gender Studies Program, it's a nice long list, Southern Studies, Film and Media Studies, the School of Visual Art and Design, the School of Library Science, and I think I got everybody. Did I mention English? Oh, and Language and Literatures. I don't think I said them. My first ICAF I attended was about 5 years ago, and I was terrified. I had taught a few comics classes here at USC, but attending ICAF in Chicago for me at a time when I knew no one else in the room, I think besides Brian, was sort of marking me, sort of claiming the idea of comic scholarship as something that was important to me as an academic. And so then and now, I really appreciate this space for being able to allow us to exchange ideas, to exchange resources, to meet people, to take this work seriously, even when we're not always taking ourselves seriously. So thank you all so much for coming. One of the reasons I know that I wouldn't have gone to that ICAF 5 years ago and given that paper on Swamp Thing and Toni Morrison is due in part to an article that our ICAF keynote speaker wrote and published in Mellis in 2007. And when I read it, by Michael Chaney, drawing on history and recent African-American graphic novels, I was just blown away. Like, this guy speaks my language. And I was so excited about his work and about the sort of scope and complexity that he brought to his discussion, that when we talked about keynote speakers for today, he was the first person who came to mind. So let me say a couple of words about Michael. Michael Chaney is Associate Professor of English and Chair of African and African American Studies at Dartmouth. He's the editor of Graphic Subjects, critical essays on autobiography and graphic novels, which brings together a lively mix of scholars to examine the use of autobiography within graphic novels, including such critically acclaimed examples such as Art Spiegelman's Mouse, Epileptic, Persepolis, Watchmen, American-Born Chinese. He's written numerous articles on topics related to comics, race, and visual culture, and he is currently awaiting publication of his manuscript, Reading Lessons in Seeing, or maybe the title has changed since then. That part of form and trope in the graphic novel, that part may have changed. Okay. So without further ado, Michael will be discussing Where, Reflections on Richard Maguire's Here and the Spatial Ontology of Comics.
Thank you so much, Yana. Yeah, why don't we dim them? Let's let things get a little intimate this morning. Why not? My first ICAF was 11 years ago in the Library of Congress. That was an amazing experience. I met so many people. I was a first-year assistant professor, unsure of myself, unsure of what I'd write my book about, unsure of what kind of scholarship I would put in the lead, because I do several things, you know. And at that time, I was wondering if I was going to focus on comics and graphic novels, or if I was going to write my first book more in keeping with what I wrote my dissertation on, which is the interrelation of visual and verbal art in slave narrative, in 19th century slave narrative. But as it turned out, I would try to maintain throughout my career a dual focus on the 19th century conventional literature and comics and graphic novels. All right, well, so without further ado, let's talk about Where. Here. I want to start with this comic. It's kind of fun if we try. I'm going to leave the microphone. I talk loud anyway. We don't need a microphone. We'll start by just reading aloud this strip, okay? So the first one, how would you say what's in the speech bubble? I love what's in the speech bubble, right? And that's a diacritical mark. No, is she saying question mark? No, probably not, right? That's going to be some sort of expressive comment that will indicate the interrogative. Maybe the next one. Huh? Really much louder there, more like an interrobang. The next one continues. Then we get, hey, what's wrong here today? And we find out, ha ha ha, April Fools.
Michael,
Yes?
we need you to be behind the mic because they're recording you.
Oh my gosh, really? All right. You're going to shove the circle in the square hole. No problem. Here I am. So then, what I'd like to draw our attention to, though, I think, is this very interesting commingling of place and temporality. When the character says, what's wrong here today, I'm drawn to the car crash of words there, the here and today. as if there's a sort of urgency to try to locate or coordinate this subject in the space of the comic. And what I find intriguing about it is the use of the temporal marker today. It's not enough to just say what's wrong here, but it's here today because it's April Fool's Day. That's the punchline. That's going to be necessary. But the day, the specificity of that day is also tied to this metaphysical notion of here. And what's going wrong here? The here is, I suppose, I would look for what exists in the span of this character's hands to be what is the deictic reference to here. And by deictic, I'm thinking about the trope of deixis, or any linguistic reference to a here, a voila or a voici, something that is close and not far. I find it fascinating because the space that is being gestured to here is the space of the character, but what the character is wondering about is what's going on in the panels we've just seen, the space that character occupies, its sort of habitat, if you will. But then also that temporal marker, the today, I think is very fascinating. And one reason is because it really resonated with some questions that I still have about Richard Maguire's Here. So I'm going to move on to just talk about that book. And unfortunately, I'm not going to talk because my talk is cued to a lot of slides, so I had to have it written out or else I would just be lost. So, where Reflections on Richard Maguire's Here. Soon after entering the window of the textual house Richard Maguire builds for us in Here, we may recognize just how profoundly the architecture of place pervades our reading and our seeing. In many ways, Here offers an alternative to the autographies studied throughout my collection Graphic Subjects, and my most recent monograph, as Kiana mentioned, Reading Lessons in Seeing. Maguire's premise enables a departure from the tyranny of the human altogether, presenting instead a series of images representing various moments of time. The year each image is taken from is dutifully reported in accompanying captions. The year comes to figure as a reading anchor, stabilizing our navigation through vastly disconnected images. Most grounding of all is the image of a corner within the house, the very spot from which all the scenes of the graphic novel are taken. That corner undergoes momentous change over the decades, witnessing history remixed, history as visual mélange. By reducing humanity as well as history to so many discrete units of personality, Here presents captivating alternatives not only to comics narrative, but also to the presumed subjects of autography. In its pages, place seems able to possess a life worth telling, a life worth recounting, but not always according to the same standards of human reason or emotion common to autobiography. According to Here, the non-human consciousness of locality makes possible new ways of understanding time and our all too fleeting relation to it, particularly when compared to the fanciful snippets of human experience recollected by the narration. In the mirror that every graphic novel imagines within its panels, the persistent place of Here takes on an iconic value. The image of the place's sense of itself, or its view of itself, surely corresponds to the corner of the house, because it is represented most often the domestic interior or corner with chimney in turn becomes iconic of the work's governing design. Despite trafficking then in the deep past of geological time, Here establishes the 20th century place of the bourgeois home and ownership as essential pictorial personality. The possibilities the book suggests for rethinking the primacy of the human in terms of place are likewise biased, eventually giving way to a decidedly human preference, not to mention a specific regional affiliation, New England and colonial history. This should come as no surprise, as Maguire is from Perth Amboy, New Jersey. The house used as a model for the illustration he has admitted in interviews is his own childhood home. What seems to be the autobiography of a place thus turns out to be the usual autobiography of a person, autobiography up to its usual tricks. But what remains intriguing about Here's fictive decentralization of authorship is the way in which the pictorial narrative prepares readers for the book's eventual retreat from ahistoricism and liberating anachronism. Indeed, Here makes use of temporality as if it were the only logic able to make sense of place, with its non-human ontic timelessness. Even though a spot in the landscape may be said to occupy a different order of time than finite living organisms do, the very structure of the narrative relies upon a deliberate rigidity of time. We see similar manipulations of time, compressions of temporal experience in lyric poetry, a connection which may lead some to classify here more as graphic lyricism than graphic prose or graphic narration. Contemplating the model of selfhood emerging from Alice Oswald's poetry, the critic and poet Darren Rhys-Jones notes how entangled the coordinates of self, object, and place become in lyric modes, producing, quote, a collective version of a historical moment in which biography and autobiography, which become our histories, are scrutinized in relation to nature and thus redefine it as they coalesce into a dramatized autobiography of a place. Armed with this critical fragment, we might leap to the conclusion that here is up to a similar lyrical commingling of autobiography and biography, conjoining a subject-less view of the invariant place in order to reconcile the human and the object world of locale. Collectivity is certainly implied, if not produced by the graphic novel, since by eschewing the individual-centered narrative punctuated by protagonists and narrators in favor of multiplicity, the panoply that defines even a single place when seen across the vast eons of its ontological situatedness, the text gives us no single entity with which to identify. Instead, we are assumed to become in the process of reading more like places than people ourselves. This mirroring is not dramatized in here as occurring between narrated subjects, but across them. Across the threshold of the page, the reader is constituted by the text to experience an assumed stasis, mirroring the unchanging point of view, whose stasis becomes the focal premise of here's unruly narrative design. Indeed, while scrutinizing the text, we may become increasingly aware of our own positionality. We may notice that we occupy a similarly immovable position relative to the views presented and represented. That affect in all its human variation, jokes, curses, boredom, laughter, manifests as an organizing principle of the text only heightens the underlying impression that there is something rather inhuman about experiencing time with the same cosmic indifference one may expect from a corner of a room. This is not to say that such a perspective is ahistorical or apolitical, and indeed I think that is the lesson of here. To be sure, the very appeal of such a narrative means little outside of our current ecological urgencies. Wait a minute. Doop, doop, doop. Yeah, how about there? And yet this is precisely the appeal of the mask in many graphic novels, particularly autobiographical ones. The autobiographical mask, wait, I know exactly where I need to be for that, and why am I so lost? Okay, whoop, sorry. Let me go back. In light of our ecological disasters, and let's just point out what indicates that on this page. You've got another page here where it's the same room, right? We've got someone dying here, and we might backtrack and start threading this together and assume that this is a character we've seen before. And here's the insert of the past, which, it's the trope, the premise, some may call it the gimmick of this narrative, is to overlay these snippets from different time periods onto one page, right? But the one on the top, I think, is fascinating. If this is New Jersey, that's New Jersey in the future. We have to look up there and, hey, New Jersey, I would say that the panoply, which is the premise of this story, makes no sense, is incomprehensible apart from our own kind of awareness, however strong, of an ecological crisis, the approach of what some have called the Anthropocene, right, the age of the death of man. So then when I'm talking about standard autobiographical masks, then I come to this one. I hope we all know that. I think I'm in the right room here. And that mask attenuates the human to anthropocenic or hyperbolic extremes, while conferring to the human, or to the mask, a tincture of the divine, whether through affect, reclaimable experience in participatory games, storytelling, or memory. Fictive, seemingly authorless and narratorless here is an admittedly imperfect example of autography, and by which I mean just an autobiography told in the comics form. But here's use of the mirror. shatters our misconceptions about either subjectivities or the devices used to reflect and produce them. You can see why I chose this to talk about the mirror. But you'll have to infer why I'm not always using the slides to illustrate what I'm saying. I'd like you to maybe make that connection. But I think I'm in the right room, and that's something that comics ask us to do all the time. So I'm not going to always have an easily understood coordinative relationship between what I'm saying and what's up there. I think that'll become more obvious as the talk progresses. All right. The same could be said of here's inherent juvenility. Its cheeky, witty play with its mirroring and the underlying humor of the text in general, all of that aids readers in breaking from another misconception about the separateness of the personal past and a planetary one. The narrative opens by indulging in the fantasy of a return to childhood, and even further back to the recesses of recorded time. In 1957, a woman walks into the living room that serves as the graphic novel's protagonist. She wonders, and now I'm wondering, oh no, yeah, there we go. What is the matter here? She wonders, now, why did I come in here again? As a cat crosses her path in an interposed panel with the caption 1999. Within several page turns, here thus initiates its narrative game. And there is more than simply a childlike reception at work in this game. We turn the pages forward and back again, returning like the initial woman to the same room to pick up on linear backstories of mini-dramas that play out as the story advances. Significantly, there is a stable group of children who get their picture taken over the course of many years. Though they age as individuals, they are arranged in the same way as a group, always in answer to a voice-off panel urging them to smile. Their unfolding lives compress many decades of existence into a series of photo portraits set in the same room. We may presume the old man who dies while telling a bad joke about dying is their father. At the very least, their father figure. The coincidence calibrates the world of here so as to accord with that of the bad joke. A juvenile presentment reigns as we are encouraged by the architecture of the text to mock death repeatedly. It is interesting to note, therefore, that a politics associated with the Picaro, or youth, initiates our entry into the text, mooring our reception of an Anthropocene, which manifests as a series of temporally disconnected but meaningfully rearranged intersections of life and landscape. The analogy between here's play with deep time and the Picaro's jaunt through the social order is apt. For me, whenever I think Picaro, I just think Huckleberry Finn. That's my Picaro, not Humphrey Clinker. Although I was made to read Humphrey Clinker. I like Humphrey Clinker. But Huckleberry Finn's my notion of a Picaro. Consider not just the many scenes of childhood glee depicted in the graphic novel, but also the implication that these scenes in particular are riven with loss. Perhaps this is why the boy from the first dozen or so pages who finally accomplishes the headstand begun pages earlier implores us, don't look at me, later on actually, when he completes that headstand. It will be childhood that humanity shall miss most after submitting to the ineluctable ravages of time. The impending ecological end that hangs about at the narrative edges of here. That end is less about nuclear annihilation or climactic apocalypse than it is about timelessness, the deconstructed meaninglessness and potential transposability of times lost, past, and passing. Overwhelmingly, the consciousness behind the narrative suggests a complementary ambivalence towards order that the Picaro harbors. Recapitulating Joseph Meeker's The Comedy of Survival, Dana Phillips notes how urban space, an analog for the social order more generally, is always represented as an effect of the Picaro's unabashed subjectivity. The incipient chaos that the Picaro senses and celebrates wherever he goes. The insight leads Phillips to speculate about the possibility of anything striking a Picaro as being wild, like the uncollected strips of lived experience that here reorchestrates out of a wilderness of meaning. Thus, the alternatives of wilderness versus civilization and of country versus city have no meaning for the Picaro. In his eyes, even the city is a wilderness. If Picaros are useful harbingers of capitalism and modernity, then their introjection or immanence within graphic novels may be seen as continuing this important work of deconstructing the terms by which our reality is made to appear visible. Here mitigates the suggestion of climatological disaster by drawing a central equivalence between the urban landscape and new formations of capital or value, according to a celebration of temporal whimsy. Reader-viewers are thus inculcated by the text to take up the same perspective associated with the knights-errant topos that the Picaro has been said to replace, as Giancarlo Maggiorno claims, so that the Picaro's wanderings give readers access to modernity's new kinds of urban knowledge. In this way, Here achieves a perspective on time similar to the one Jared Gardner ascribes to newspaper comic strips. Both present new prospects for experiencing history by rigorously sketching out for readers the soon-to-be past traces of the living present. It goes without saying that the narrative design of Here proposes a temporal simultaneity or juxtaposition as a type of play for readers to enjoy. But to what deeper purpose are we presented with this eco-critically provocative matching exercise? Here is structured like a game in more ways than one. On the one hand, it eschews linear unity and the focality of human protagonists and characters, as I've said. On the other, it makes reading and viewing comparable to interpretive practices of decoding and puzzle solving. Conceptually, readers must bring together at least two disparate units of visual information in order to grasp the first level of the text's insinuation of plot. Ben Franklin with grandson visiting his estranged son, the 1950s housewife who is widowed and visited by archaeologists whose sons grow up to play a futuristic board game together, where they push their faces through colored squares and their face comes out the other side of the square, younger or different or something. There's also the Native American couple who hear an alarming sound in the woods in 1609. These narrative connections can never be confirmed by the text, existing on what could be classified as a first level of signification and corresponding to the text's creation of a ludus or play space. The game we play with the images is rarely contrastive. So long as we read for narrative continuities, we are bound to encounter two panels facing one another as being in spatial dialogue, and contiguity is synonymous with dialogue in Here. Two proximate panels are often shown to have narratively proximate timescapes, their content symbolically touching one another. For example, in two facing panels on a background captioned 1970, the panel on the left from 1959 shows a housewife asking her husband for his keys, watch, wallet. The panel on the right from 1954 shows the back of someone unseen in a lounge chair who offers a sociological reading for the conjugal behavior just witnessed. It's a symbiotic relationship. It's a little ritual they do, a little performance. That's the voice I think it's using. Readers are hereby solicited by the text to fold the diagnosis onto the symptom, the content of the counterpoised image in a coordinative matching exercise across the axis of the book's spine. Once initiated, this game plays out across many more capacious gaps in time and space, over many more page turns. Indeed, during play, the page swells with renewed formal meanings. It encodes planetary time-space as an insuperable distance, separating the Native American couple, for example, lying in the woods in 1609 from the archaeology students who come to search for their remains several pages later. But the page also encodes a contrary metric of distance too. It stages the bridgeable collapse of difference that makes the native seem to inhabit the same present, according to the same rules of presence, if you will, as the archaeologist or any other figure in the book. This collapse occurs so long as we endeavor to read one step beyond the matching game's reliance on narrative coherence, which is the game's point, after all. Narrative connection, Here's game seems to suggest, makes sympathy possible, not to mention humor, irony, and epiphanic moments of cosmic coincidence. But narrative also forecloses other kinds of connection, more crucial to the book's less than subtle eco-criticisms. In our game's As with our readings, we are prone to confront the cosmological fact of our eventual demise, as when we notice the archaeology student in 1986 wearing a yellow t-shirt that says, in morbid echo of the Yellow Kid perhaps, future transitional fossil. This image appears across the page from another of two elderly men in 2050 playing a game with the floating colored rectangles I mentioned. How like the reading of a comic that game is, and how much like the comic's mirror this game looks. As one player pushes his face through the panel, becoming a younger version of himself, we observe the transformative, youth-giving powers of the imagination. We observe reading as play. At this moment, game playing turns ominous, however. Like reading and seeing, playing is shown once again to be a unifying practice that creates identification across chasms of difference, across planes of experience or eons of geological time. But in here, all these practices are bound to snap under the duress of their fictive impossibility, their impossibility, in other words, beyond the ineluctable fictions of the pictorial. That impossibility is even more salient when the pictorial is materialized, a clarity that was recently witnessed by viewers of an installation of McGuire's pictures in Frankfurt, Germany. This was in February this year. Finding the game mechanics of here is relatively easy. Teasing out the text's autobiographical effects, less so. It is also at this point in the application that one struggles to fit the narrowest generic definitions onto here's patently fictional design. Neither Künstlerroman nor autography in the traditional sense, McGuire's text seems indifferent to the gospel of self-reflection espoused in most of the memoirs discussed in comic scholarship. The fact that here is not a self-announced autobiography helps to conceal the apprenticeship strategies in reading and viewing that structure it. Here is thus ideal for identifying how autobiography operates when it is not a generic paradigm but a mode. What I mean to say is that although here is not an autobiography in the strictest sense, it is autobiographical. Traces of that ambivalence may even be read into the front matter. There, McGuire spells out some of the legalistic intentions and indemnifications typical to autobiography. This is a work of fiction. All incidents and dialogue and all characters, with the exception of some well-known historical and public figures, are products of the author's imagination and are not to be construed as real. On the facing page, we are given an image to accompany the truth disclaimers and copyright information, the icon of the fireplace, which anchors our foray into McGuire's imaginary through time. More text in the form of a dedication appears above the icon in the same bold style as the disclaimer, "To my family." Interestingly, like the loophole into verity that the presence of Ben Franklin presents in an otherwise fictional work of art, the dedication seeks to gift the art not to public figures, but to private ones. That these particular receivers of the work are cited there, my family, at that precise spot above the fireplace, that takes on further significance when we notice that the dedication rests on the same site as other important object symbols: a mirror, a wall-mounted TV, a star-shaped ornament, and sometimes a landscape painting, which not coincidentally resembles the actual landscapes that fill those pages meant to depict the area before its domestication by way of farming, European settlement, and the building of the house. Thus, while there are no recognizable self-portraits of the artist hard at work, no indications of the metafictional exigencies crucial to the Künstlerroman, here, nevertheless, conjures the work behind the work and the creator who both carries out and covers over that labor. The Künstlerroman petitions us to heed two related ideologies, commingling themes of Oedipal competition, in which rebellious sons combat bourgeois fathers and all they stand for by acquiring the métier of the artist, as well as themes of art's resistance to commerce. In the latter, art's position somehow apart from the market parallels the dream in the former of the privileged but somehow unco-opted son. And although these themes of Oedipus and father and Oedipal contest in capitalism are stretched throughout here's prism of metaphor, both of them are resonant, I would say. Paternal anxiety enshrouds the text's strange fascination with its singularly recognizable historical figure, good old Ben Franklin. A forefather who in Maguire's hands plays the role of literal father rather than politician or inventor. Franklin's presence amplifies the temporal conceit of here, amplifying its embedded game to include history itself. Franklin is less a fixed or sacred icon than a game token, an image we as reader viewers are enjoined to figurarize in unexpectedly imaginative or ludic ways, as mere costume or one fleck of the human experience among many. Thus, the text nods to the work behind its work, that labor is neither about self-portraits or seeing Maguire drawing a panel from here. We don't need to see those things to see the labor behind this text. It is rather about the reading that we have to do in order to unsee Franklin, according to these ludic terms. It is rather fitting, then, for a text that dreams itself to be subjectless and perhaps authorless as well, to concomitantly fantasize its readers to be decoders who must lose themselves in the colored panels before them, like the old man who becomes temporarily young again while pushing his head through the abstract squares of color. This is perhaps the real self-portrait of the work behind here's work, an image of reading as playing and transformation, as movement through the text transformational and transformation-granting pages. Ultimately, however, these exercises in reading, playing, and laboring bring us to the brink of an impossible community. A tantalizing community dangles before us as a result of the graphic novel's play with masks. While attempting to figuratively push our heads through the panels of here, we are inevitably moved to cogitate an elsewhere, not a here but a there, a back there of irretrievable history. Although supplied with ample training, Western reader viewers may be less inclined to grow in fresh directions when confronted with one of the text's few narrative situations, such as the native couple. These are, I'll explain this because it doesn't coordinate. These are some of the drawings that have been published that are sketches that informed the eventual drawing that you saw a clip of. So what I think is at stake here is that couple is engaged in what I think the text leaves a bit ambivalent. Are they lovers? At first you assume that they're lovers, but then you wonder, are they out in the woods, and is there going to be a consensual act of lovemaking that happens here, or is there something else going on? It's very, very ambiguous. And they hear something, and we never know what it is they hear. But the very flicker of their situation arouses disturbing connections between ambivalence and denunciation, genocide, and something far more, something different. In addition to creating uncertainty about the couple's motivations, here creates uncertainty about an impending danger they sense but cannot confront or name. At times, the text suggests it may be an animal in the forest drawing near. At others, as mentioned, the panel arrangements encourage us to locate that danger in the archaeologists who knock at the house, now marking their remains. It would be no great leap for us to imagine at least 3 other possible sources for their alarm. 1, a subsequent history of Indian removal and genocide. 2, a future-oriented projection of Anthropocenic destruction. And 3, us. We are thus uncomfortably gathered into the graphic novel's construction of a colonial gaze and made to play along in its dream of time as a sort of Tower of Babel. It has been one of the aims of this talk to show that how we are automatically and often unconsciously put to work repairing the linguistic and semiotic fissures of that tower in the comics. Through acts of closure and a largely unexamined predilection for narrativity, the comics form conscripts readers to suture the gaps even when they represent tumultuous ruptures of history, traumas in all senses. Perhaps this is why here's lightness, its insouciant play with deep time, is solemn as well as ironic. Each trivial exchange draws us further and further towards the end. Though enlarged by our need for connection, even in the face of catastrophic rupture, each lost moment points us to the next rupture, the final closure, so that every reading engenders a community of remembrance. Here summons a community of mourning for an end that has not yet happened. The contradictions in such a formation mirror those of the text's potential, its potential for obscene play with native extinction, in which one intolerable demise, or not yet demise, is figured in terms of another, more tolerable demise. In other words, the certainty with which we are induced to read the not yet demise of the native couple mirrors, produces, and thus encourages us to suture the not yet demise of the planet. Like so many so-called graphic novels, here prods us to contemplate the inverse of its central conceit. Instead of glorying in the caprice of place as an enduring construct, we are solicited by the text to see place as timely, to see locale as perishable, fleeting. Place is not the unkillable other to subjectivity, as here inadvertently teaches us at the start of our gameplay or reading. Place is already dead in the text. It has been killed off a long time ago by time. Like the chickens in March, and I'll say more about that later, the natives in here cipher an impossible relation to history as rupture. But they also represent a placeholder for a desire for community, which is the same thing as a desire for unity, relation, or narrative. It is that desire which all graphic narratives perpetuate, flouting it at times, serving it at others, but always in anticipation of a reader who will change and grow in response to instabilities essential to the form, of figure and concept, drawing and reality, selves and communities, there and here and then. Thank you very much.